My brother's rehearsal dinner was supposed to be the happiest night of that whole family. 53 people rented out the back room of Harrington's steakhouse, my mother in her green silk dress that she'd been saving for a special occasion, and my father stood up, clinked his glass, and said, "To our son, who made us proud every single day of his life." Then he looked straight at me across the table and smiled. Not a warm smile. The kind that means something else entirely. "And to my daughter," he said, "who reminds us that not everyone can be exceptional." The table laughed. A few people shifted uncomfortably. My brother's fiancée looked down at her plate, and I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth, 31 years old, a licensed electrician with my own crew, and I felt 12 again. That was 8 months ago. What happened next changed everything. Not because of anything I did, but because the universe apparently has a sense of timing that I don't. Let me back up. My name is not important. What's important is that I grew up the second child in a family where first meant everything. My brother Calloway, Cal, everyone calls him Cal, was the golden one from the moment he was born. He was the one who got into Georgetown. He was the one who went to law school and joined a firm downtown that had 3 names on the letterhead and a view of the river. He called home every Sunday. He remembered birthdays. He was, by every metric my parents used to measure, a person. A success. I became an electrician, not because I failed at anything. I was good at school. I just didn't want to sit behind a desk and argue about contracts for 40 years. I wanted to build things. I wanted to see what I made when I was done with a day. My parents smiled and nodded when I told them my plan, the same way they smiled and nodded when I was 8, and said I wanted to be an astronaut, like it was a phase, like if they waited long enough, I'd come to my senses. I didn't come to my senses. I got my journeyman's license at 24, my master's at 27, and by 30 I had a crew of 6 and contracts with 3 commercial developers in the metro area. I was doing fine. Better than fine, honestly. But I stopped saying that out loud because every time I mentioned work, my father found a way to steer the conversation back to Cal's latest case, or my mother would say something like, "That's wonderful," in the voice she used when she was only half listening. My boyfriend, Trent, thought I should just stop going home for holidays. "They don't deserve you," he said more than once. Trent grew up in a family that celebrated people, so he genuinely couldn't understand why I kept returning to one that didn't. But that's the thing about family. Logic doesn't really apply. Trent and I had been together for 2 years when Cal got engaged to Portia. Portia was, and I say this without resentment, exactly the kind of person my parents had always hoped I would become. She was finishing her MBA. She wore blazers to casual events. She spoke 3 languages, which my mother mentioned every time Portia came up in conversation. Her family was from Greenwich, Connecticut, which my father mentioned slightly less often but with more reverence. The rehearsal dinner was at Harrington's a Thursday evening in March, and I arrived with Trent, who was wearing a navy jacket and looked handsome and completely unaware of what the next 2 hours were going to cost us both emotionally. Portia's family was already there when we walked in. Her father, a man named Mr. Waverly, the kind of man who introduces himself by his last name, was at the bar with 2 other men I didn't recognize. Her mother was arranging place cards that did not need to be rearranged. Portia herself was glowing in a cream-colored dress standing next to Cal, who spotted me from across the room and waved in that easy way he had, completely unbothered by everything, because he had never had a reason to be bothered. The seating arrangement put Trent and me at the far end of the second table. Not the kids' table, technically, but adjacent to it. My mother had done the seating. I noticed that the people nearest to my parents, nearest to the center of the room, nearest to Portia's parents, were Cal's law school friends and their spouses. People with titles, people who could hold a conversation about the right things. Trent didn't say anything about the seating. He just put his hand briefly on my knee under the table, which is how I knew he'd noticed too. Dinner was fine for a while. I had the salmon. Trent had the short rib. We talked to the couple beside us, friends of Cal's from Georgetown, who were nice enough and very impressed with themselves, but in an unconscious way that made it almost forgivable. The wine was good. I thought, maybe this will just be a normal evening. Maybe I'll get through it. Then my father stood up. He wasn't a tall man, my father, but he had a courtroom voice, low and carrying, the kind that fills a room without effort. He'd been a family court judge for 19 years before he retired. 53 years ago, he started. And I remember thinking, here we go. Your mother and I made a decision that we have never once regretted. He meant having Cal. He always meant having Cal when he talked like this, even when he technically phrased it to include both of us. We raised a son who is principled, who is disciplined, who chose a path that reflects the values of this family, and tonight he is bringing into that family a woman of equal character and accomplishment. He raised his glass toward Portia, who smiled beautifully. Her father raised his glass back. Then my father looked at me. I don't know if anyone else caught the shift in his expression. The way his smile didn't quite change, but his eyes did something different. And to my daughter, he said, and his voice had just enough lightness in it to make what came next sound like a joke, who reminds us that not everyone can be exceptional. Some of us find our calling into more practical pursuits. A few people chuckled. I heard it. I felt it in my sternum like a dull impact. My mother was looking at her glass. Cal was looking somewhere to the left of me, a careful, neutral expression on his face. And Trent had gone very still beside me. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I've cried about my parents plenty, but not in front of them, not in years. What I did was pick up my glass and take a sip of wine and look at my father with an expression I had spent 3 decades practicing. Pleasant, unreadable, unaffected. It took everything I had. But I did it. The dinner moved on. Toasts were made. Portia's mother said something lovely about love being an adventure. Cal thanked everyone for coming. The creme brulee arrived, and then Portia's father, Mr. Waverly, leaned slightly forward from his seat at the head table. 3 tables away from me, but the room had gotten quieter by then, and said something to the man beside him. I wouldn't have thought anything of it, except that the man beside him was looking at Trent. I noticed because Trent had noticed. He'd gone still again, the way he went still when he was processing something. Mr. Waverly said something else, and the man beside him shook his head, and then Mr. Waverly stood up. He didn't make a speech. He just walked across the room, which drew a few glances, because it was the kind of decisive movement that draws glances, and he stopped beside our table, and he looked at Trent and said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you Trent Osborne?" Trent said yes. Mr. Waverly's expression did something complicated. The Osborne who did the Meridian Harbor rebuild. Trent said yes again, quieter this time, the way he always got when someone recognized that work. The room was not paying attention yet, but my mother was. I saw her head turn. That project, Mr. Waverly said, and he shook his head slowly, changed the conversation in this city about what sustainable commercial construction actually looks like. I've been trying to figure out who was behind it for 2 years. He put out his hand. I'm on the board of the Waverly Foundation. We've been looking for someone to lead the Infrastructure Restoration Initiative. Can I give you my card? Silence. Not the whole room at once. It spread the way silence does when something important is happening and people sense it before they understand it. My father had sat back down. He was looking at Trent with an expression I had never seen on his face before, and I had spent 31 years watching that face. Trent shook Mr. Waverly's hand. He accepted the card. He said something gracious because Trent was always gracious, something about being glad the work had spoken for itself. And then Mr. Waverly turned to my father, because of course he did. Because my father was right there, and Mr. Waverly was the kind of man who connected everything, and he said, "You must be so proud. Your daughter has extraordinary taste." My father said nothing for a full 3 seconds. I counted. I want to be precise about what Trent actually is, because the Meridian Harbor thing sounds impressive, and it was, but it's not the whole picture. Trent Osborne grew up the son of a contractor in Dayton, Ohio. He learned electrical work from his father before he was old enough to drive. He got his license, then he kept going. Structural engineering, sustainable systems design, a master's program he finished at night while working full days. At 35, he had become, without ever particularly announcing it, of the most respected names in green infrastructure on the East Coast. He didn't talk about it much. He wasn't performing humility, he was genuinely more interested in the next project than in the last one. He'd never mentioned the Waverly Foundation because he'd never thought to. It just wasn't how he talked about his life. I had known all of this. I hadn't hidden it. My parents had simply never asked. The rest of the evening passed in a way I can only describe as pressurized. Conversations continued, but with a different frequency underneath them. Cal found me on the way out and squeezed my shoulder and said, "You okay?" And I said yes, and it wasn't entirely a lie. Portia hugged me at the door, warm and genuine, and whispered that she hoped we could spend more time together, and I believed her. My father shook Trent's hand before we left. Firmly, with both hands, the way he shook hands with people he wanted to impress. I didn't say anything in the car. Trent drove. After about 10 minutes, I said, "I'm sorry about tonight." He glanced over at me. "For which part?" I said, "For my father's toast." He said, "I know you are, but you don't have to apologize for him." We drove the rest of the way home without talking, but it wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that two people can be in when they understand each other. My mother called me the next morning. She said she wanted to explain something. I said, "Okay." She said my father hadn't meant it the way it came out. I said I had heard it the way it came out. She said my father had the highest respect for skilled tradespeople. I said that was an interesting thing to learn at a rehearsal dinner. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was sorry. It was the first time in my adult life I had heard her say that to me without a qualifier attached. "Know if you felt, or to the extent that." Just sorry. My father called the following week. He asked if he could take me to lunch. We went to a diner near my office, which surprised me. I expected somewhere he'd feel comfortable, somewhere with a wine list. He ordered coffee and a club sandwich, and he looked at his hands for a while before he said anything. "I've been thinking about what I said," he started. "Good," I said. He looked up. I think he expected me to say it was all right, or to help him into the apology the way I usually did, smoothing the way for him to exit an uncomfortable situation. I didn't do that this time. I waited. "It wasn't a compliment," he said finally. "I know that. I've been telling myself it was a joke, but it wasn't. It was something I've been thinking for a long time, and it came out sideways and in public, and that was wrong. All of it." I asked him why. Not why the joke, why the thinking, why for a long time had he looked at what I'd built and seen something lesser. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the waitresses refilled his coffee without him noticing. "My father was a laborer," he said. "He worked a factory floor his whole life. He was brilliant. Genuinely, actually brilliant, and no one ever knew it, because no one ever asked. He wanted me to be something that couldn't be overlooked. A title, letters after my name. He needed that for me." He looked up. "I think I carried that into how I looked at you. I'm not excusing it. I'm trying to explain how something that wrong gets into a person without them noticing." I thought about Trent, who had all the letters and none of the need to broadcast them. I thought about my father's father, a man I'd barely known, who had wanted his son to be something that couldn't be overlooked. I thought about myself at 22, walking onto a job site for the first time with a belt around my waist, and the specific satisfaction of a person's doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. "I need you to actually see me," I said. Not fix me, see me. What I do and why it matters and that I'm good at it. I paused. I need that to be enough. He nodded. He didn't trust himself to say much, I think, but he nodded. We're in family therapy now. The three of us. My parents and me. Cal comes when he can, which is less often than he should, but he's trying. Portia and Trent came to Sunday dinner last month, and my mother asked Trent actual questions about Meridian Harbor, and I watched my father listen to the answers like he was hearing something for the first time. The Waverly Foundation project came through. Trent accepted it. He's been on 3 calls with Mr. Waverly since the rehearsal dinner, and every time he comes home from one, he's got that focused look he gets when something interesting is beginning. I still drive to job sites. I still come home with my knuckles scraped and my brain tired in the good way, the way that comes from solving actual problems with your hands. Last week, I landed the largest contract my company has ever had. A school district renovation, 12 buildings, 2-year project. I called my father to tell him. He said, "That's incredible. Tell me more." It was the first time he'd said that. I don't know if my parents will ever fully unlearn what they spent decades believing about what a life should look like. I think my father understands now, at least in part, that he confused prestige with worth, and that those are not the same thing and were never the same thing. I think my mother is trying harder than she ever has to hear me when I speak. It's not fixed. I don't think families fix exactly. I think they adjust over time when people decide they want to. I decided a long time ago that I wanted to. The difference now is that they're deciding too. Trent made coffee this morning and brought it to me while I was going over the school district blueprints at the kitchen table. He didn't say anything. He just set it down and kissed the top of my head and went back to his own work. Outside the window, the neighborhood was just starting to wake up. And I sat there with my coffee and my blueprints and the quiet, and I thought, this is what I built. Not just the work. All of it. This. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to justify any of it to anyone.